Let's get started with our Friday nightcap. Joining me, my NBC News colleague and friend, Antonia Hilton. She is also the co-host of the hit podcast, South Lake. Hayes Brown, columnist and editor for MSNBC Daily. Ron Insana, CNBC senior analyst. And Liz Winstead, co-creator of The Daily Show and founder and chief creative officer for Abortion Access Front. All right, the biggest story of the week, everybody knows it. The former president of the United States of America charged with 37 felonies in federal court. That is on top of the 34-count indictment filed here in New York City, not to mention the recent civil judgment against him or the other grand juries hearing evidence that could lead to even more indictments. Yet, Ron, you're the math person, so I turn to you. Despite all of this, Donald J. Trump leads in the polls for Republicans. Some Republican members of Congress are defending him and attacking the Department of Justice. And some of the people he's running against are already saying they would pardon him, despite the fact that they finally have a clear lane to go at him. Can you explain this to me? It doesn't add up.
None of it adds up. And Vivek Ramaswamy, who you referenced, asking everyone to commit to pardoning President Trump should he be convicted, is beyond the pale. What I would say, Stephanie, having been a child of the Watergate era, watching the Senate Select Committee, watching President Nixon resign in 1974, and having an entire country shocked and outraged by that experience, where this makes that look like romper room school, it is both shocking and terrifying to me that there is no unanimity of opinion on this, that there are people siding with the president who not only took sensitive foreign policy, defense, and other documents, but shared them with other individuals, which is tantamount to espionage, depending on how you want to define it. This, to me, is the crime of the century at the executive level. And what is shocking to me is everything that you just said, that there are people who would support him in this and turn on the Justice Department, whereas in Watergate, there was a broad, unanimous opinion that Richard Nixon was wrong. And we just don't have that today. And in my mind, it's disturbing, it's shocking, and it's entirely inexplicable.
It feels, too, like, and we've watched this sort of march towards, there's no foundation with which we can just all agree that this is bad. And I'm like, if we could just harness gaslighting as an energy source, it feels like
natural gaslighting.
Yes, natural gaslighting would be amazing. You know, if you could just fill a tank with gas, maybe somebody just spews, you know, transcripts from Alex Jones's show into a tank, and but it feels like so insane. And how do we wake up every day, regular folks, watching this amoral behavior? Is anything not
because
okay?
Lots of regular folks don't see it. Antonia, you report outside of New York City, outside of Chicago and Los Angeles, in parts of the country who wake up and they are told by, quote unquote, their news media, well, Joe Biden did that, or Mike Pence did that, or Hillary Clinton did that. None of those things are true. I mean, Trump openly lied about the Presidential Records Act over and over this week.
The inexplicable has become the norm right now. And I look at this case the same way that I look at a lot of the other culture and information war stories that we're all covering right now, because I spend a lot of time in Texas, Tennessee, in Florida, where you talk to people, whether it's about critical race theory or it's about even the definition of the word abortion. And people do not operate off the same definitions. And it's interesting to watch the Democrats right now after all of this news, because in some ways they're sitting on their hands at the moment, not coming out and really making the case very clear or casting the president, the former president, as a criminal, you know, in the way that decades ago people were. And instead, they're letting Republicans and conservative activists actually kind of set the terms, describe what's happened. And a lot of Americans, no matter what side they're actually on, you'll meet them when you're out in the field, and they will be talking about these issues in the terms that those activists have actually set. And, you know, I think for us in the news media, it's added to the responsibility of you're out there and you're trying to redefine and explain and bring people the facts. But once they've already heard a narrative, it's really, really hard.
Yeah. Democrats are being largely quiet or muted, certainly the White House. Is that the right move?
I feel like yes and no. Like, I agree that it is frustrating to see Republicans and right-wing activists try and like set the narrative of like, oh, he declassified everything. That's clearly not true. There's audio tapes to prove that, but the people who need to hear that aren't going to listen to it. What I fear, though, is that if Democrats were to come out and loudly denounce Donald Trump, I feel like people would just hear that as more of the same. Like, and that's part of the
this is just all
but
political.
that's part of the problem with Donald Trump is that because he has for so many years now been breaking norms, been breaking laws, that it does all sort of start to blur together. Like the way that Trump talks about the Russia investigation or the Russia hoax, as he calls it. That Robert Mueller found instances that where he was probably obstructing justice, and so people hear now like, oh, he's charged with obstructing justice, and they think they're back on the same thing that they've always been on, which is Trump is a crook, which is still true. It was true then, and it's true now. But trying to get people to hear the new version of it is difficult.
But there are only two people who should absolutely be silent about this: President Biden and Vice President Harris, and possibly Merrick Garland should be distanced from any conversation about this. Every other Democrat should be going full stop, pointing out that if indeed these allegations are true, this is such a massive national security breach that no one who does that should ever be entrusted with the highest office in the land. And I would repeat that over and over. And I don't care if a Democrat did it. Whoever does it should never hold that office again.
Well, and it just feels like there's got to be a balance between drumming, and constantly bringing a PowerPoint presentation to a knife fight. I mean, we are, right? Because that's what I feel like happens all the time.
A laser pointer?
A laser pointer might, blind you a little.
Yes.
But, just going back to what you said, the narratives have been set so often by the crackpots. Whether we're talking about reproductive rights, whether we're talking about the environment, whether we're talking about January 6th, all of it. And regular folks just start parroting stuff, and you're like, oh my God.
They're not even bringing in a PowerPoint presentation. They're bringing an overhead projector. I mean, it's really,
true.
really
But
bad.
what is it, right? Trump can't seem to find a lawyer these days.
Yeah, that's not a good
What
sign.
is it? What do these lawyers know about him or about what he did that Republicans or Republican members of Congress don't seem to know or aren't willing to admit, right? Lawyers are usually willing to work with people, especially high-profile
Well, they'd also
people.
like to get paid, which we know is not going to happen.
Bingo.
But also, I feel like Trump seems to be hiring lawyers who are good PR people. He wants people who are going to go out and defend him on all fronts. And what happens in court, it seems to be weirdly less important to him. Because you saw, what's her name, Aline Hababa, go out during the arraignment and basically read off Trump truth socials, this is the destruction of the country, we're not going to have a country anymore, all of that. And at no point, I feel like, have we heard from his lawyers, from Republicans, from anyone, a solid legal defense for what he's done. And I think that's fascinating, because they are so focused on winning the court of public opinion, but they're doing nothing to show how they're going to beat these charges in court. And I don't think they have a strategy at this point. I think we saw reporting from the New York Times that Christopher Kais, who is one of Trump's lawyers, he took the case before he realized, oh, this guy's not going to just back down. And now he's kind of stuck with it, with his $3 million retainer, clearly. But he's still on the case, and I don't know if he knows how he's going to win this one.
The Washington Post reported that his lawyers recommended he settle prior ever to going to court, and he refused because he thought there was a political advantage to going to court. If he's convicted of this, it's a zero advantage.
Because he believes when he is the focus of the news media, that's all that matters. He believes all press is good press, and in his mind or in his reality, he's never really faced consequences for it. So why wouldn't he think that?
Well, this is such an orders of magnitude different issue than stiffing somebody in the construction business or, whatever he did in his prior life, going bankrupt 6 times, whatever you want to focus on. This is a breach of national security of the utmost importance. He showed maps to people with no classified rankings. He showed a war plan to someone, at least according to the allegations in the indictment. That's not just what he's done in his life. This is very, very, in my mind, this is mind-blowing stuff.
Right, and for once, it's not focused on his, behavior as a person, his personal failings. It's actually based on him acting outside the interest of the United States, which is fascinating.
He is running for president and is currently the front runner to get the Republican nomination. So when you look to voters around the country, young voters, old voters, Democrats and independents, what is going to get them the most motivated? Voting against Republicans and Donald Trump, for Joe Biden's agenda? Or is it issues like access to reproductive health or climate or cultural issues? What's going to get people fired up?
I think it's going to be issues. I don't think it's going to be Joe Biden's second term. especially, if you're looking at states like North Carolina right now, where so much hangs in the balance. There was just this quick flip-flop on abortion access in that state. When you talk to women of all ages, spent months in North Carolina covering the midterms. That was the first thing they brought up consistently, whether they were young women just voting for the first time, getting out of high school, or elderly women who had, 20 grandkids telling me that they wanted their granddaughters to have access to this. And that was their number one concern. And now the stakes in that state have been raised. But I think it's going to be issues focused. And I think that's, again, why the definition of these terms matter, because when you are on the back foot constantly and you're the last person to come to the table and get to set the rules, you have lost so much ground with folks already. And that's really what's at stake here. People's basic fundamental understanding of some of these things that we just can't come to any kind of agreement on.
Liz, next week will be 1 year since Dobbs was overturned. How much of a motivator is this? To Antonia's point about setting the narrative, how often do you hear in Republican circles those 9-month abortions that don't happen? Yet Democrats don't seem to say that enough.
Now, Tim Scott said that Democrats want abortions up to 52 weeks.
That's a
he
lie.
Literally, you are
52 weeks.
52 weeks.
I mean,
But I think
So your
to your
3-month-old
point
baby
exactly.
52
Yes,
weeks?
exactly. It's a mess.
Are you kidding me?
No, you got to find the clip. It is so good. It is so good. It's like, oh my God.
Gestational cycle of an elephant or something like that.
I think, and as somebody who's worked in the reproductive space for 10 years, asking and begging people to cover it was hard enough. And so really knowing that when I would go out on tour and I would tell my own abortion story, my inbox, the people would flood to me to say, I've had an abortion too, and I've never known who to talk to about it because we haven't invited the conversation. So now that this conversation has opened, people who never before have told their stories are talking about it and understand that had they not had access, the entire trajectory of their life would have been different. And what that trajectory is to every person is very different. But I think, and this is the big part, is that people are looking at it as a whole. Instead of just their own abortion, they're saying, I want this for my community. This is good for the way that we do business, live our lives, have our communities thrive.
And Steph, you brought up math, right? One of the interesting things about the math, as we saw in the midterms.
Is that no one's pregnant for 52 weeks?
No, there's that. But also, everybody talks about how these events give Donald Trump more support with his base, which is a fixed number. These other issues about which we are discussing affect a broad swath of people. And that may, as in 2022, as in 2020, may very well make the difference in the election. His base won't get bigger.
We have to take a commercial break. I want you to think about this one thing during commercial. Tim Scott is running for president. He is not married. He doesn't have any kids. I'm fine with that. Imagine if he was a woman running for president who's not married and doesn't have kids. Imagine what a huge issue that would be for Americans and how much we would be talking about it. Think about that.